School, y'all. It's wonderful to have you here in this space. My name is Aisha Bell Hardaway, and I am the director of the Social Justice Institute here at Case Western Reserve University. I also am a professor of law here at the law school. That's the reason why we're in this building today. It seemed to be best suited for the format of today's discussion with Aundra Willis Carrasco. There's so many new faces in the space. I think it's important for me to maybe introduce myself just a little bit to you. I am born and raised for the most part here in Cleveland, with the exception of a small period of some time that I spent on a small family farm in Georgia as a child. But I've been in Cleveland pretty much all of my life. My research and my writing is on the area of my first and my most favorite piece is about reparations and the right to reparations for Black people as descendants of American servitude, involuntary servitude. And then my most recent piece, which is also a favorite baby of mine, is about the rise of police unions on the back of the Black freedom movement struggle during the 1960s. And so I just share that in case folks, I know folks, you all may not know me and you may wonder who I am and why it's important for me to have conversations like this. At SJI, it's extremely important to me that community, unaffiliated with our campus, feels welcome in our spaces, are included in the conversations that we have about topics that impact our community, right? Directly our community. And when I say our community, I mean Black folks, because I grew up in community with Black people, and our campus is largely surrounded by, or situated in the middle of Black community. And that brings me to the story of Mr. Winston Willis. For some years now, I have been very, very interested in hearing more and understanding more about the situation that occurred with Mr. Willis. I had learned from my family about the vibrant sort of area and businesses along Euclid and Cedar and Carnegie that aren't necessarily connected with Mr. Willis's story, but nonetheless is a demonstration of a vibrant Black community. And of course, I'm very, very curious in understanding, both as a lawyer, but also as a community member, understanding how and why what happened, which is why when there was an opportunity to buy this book, me and Allison, where's Allison? Oh, there's Allison, raise your hand. Allison is the administrative assistant, and the reason why everything is flowing so well at SJI right now. We jumped on the chance to buy this and to start reading it. So welcome to you all. Ms. Willis Carrasco is here with us via Zoom. She lives in Texas. She's going to speak with you all about what's happened with her and her brother, what happened to her brother, and her process for publishing, self-publishing her book, which is also proof of the importance of our voices being centered in our experiences, regardless of who may or may not deem them as worthy, if you will. And want to give her the chance to explain both the history, her family's history, and the process of publishing this book. And then we'll open it up for questions. I see a lot of, we have our Social Justice Institute scholars, so this is like an intergenerational conversation today. We have young people, we have the rest of us, and I'm really, really looking forward to the conversation. So I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Willis Carrasco.
Okay, hello everyone, can you hear me? Okay, I wish I could be there with you, and I really thank you for your interest in my brother's story. Winston and I are both in our 80s now, and I'm not doing much traveling these days due to age-related health issues. But I really thank you for being there and your interest in the story. I'll just start at the beginning. I actually started writing Winston's story back in the 70s when I was still living in Cleveland. I lived in Cleveland from 1963 until 1977 when I moved to California. But at the time, no one locally would publish the story, none of the local newspapers or anything, because Winston was sometimes viewed as public enemy number one because he was so outspoken about revealing the racism he was experiencing. So I continued to write the story when I was in California and published it in a couple of magazines, but no one locally in Cleveland was interested in publishing it. But the book came to be because after I finished writing the book, I submitted to several big publishers in New York. And after they reached out to the clinic, they got scared off and they kind of dropped the ball and weren't interested in publishing. And I also had a deal to do a documentary on my brother, and the same thing happened. They also dropped off. So that's why I decided to self-publish the book, because I really think his story is important. And the main reason is because for the most part, for decades, Winston's history and everything that he did and accomplished in Cleveland, it appeared to be erased. They tried to erase his history. And I'm just determined that my brother's history is that important. And I think Winston is as much a part of Cleveland history as Terminal Tower or any of the other local landmarks. So I've continued to tell his story, continued to write his story. He's 84 years old now and in fragile health, but he's still very much a legal scholar, which he had to become over the years after all of his properties were stolen without payment. And he went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where his case was docketed and accepted, but a few months later, they denied an oral hearing. So the case is still a part of the record of the Supreme Court. If you just docket the docket and just pull up his name, it's still there. But let me go back to Winston's history. The way I structured the book, I felt that it was important to reveal what shaped him as a man. And that begins in 1939 in Montgomery, Alabama, where he was born. And my mother actually told me that she named Winston after Winston Churchill, because when she was pregnant with him, just before he was born, she used to hear Winston Churchill talking about the winds of war coming, over in the UK. And he was such an amazing orator that she was really impressed. And she said that she always felt that Winston was destined for greatness even before he was born. So that's why she named him after Winston Churchill. And in our home in Montgomery, Alabama, Winston has always been a businessman. I think he was born to be a businessman, because even as a little boy, he would go out. He was the first one to get up in our house in the morning, even long before we went to school. And he had a little red radio wagon, and he would go out into the woods and chop kindling, and he would go around in the neighborhood and sell it. And he would do errands for people to make money. And there was this lady in our neighborhood who used to sell candy to all the kids, and he actually set up a business with her. And he was doing things like that when he was just a little boy. And also, all of the men in our family were self-employed, and they all owned a lot of property. They all had their own businesses. Some became lawyers, and those were Winston's role models. And those were the people that he really patterned himself after. Our mother's brother, who lived next door to us, he owned several dry cleaners and several grocery stores in Montgomery. And he was also a favorite of Winston's as well. And so our family joined in the Great Migration and moved north to Detroit in 1954. And that's where Winston, he was enrolled in high school, but he was really, really dissatisfied with what he claimed, that he said, these people can't teach me anything. They don't know anything. So he dropped out of high school in 10th grade. And our father was in the floor covering business. So he taught my two brothers, Winston and our older brother, about all the tile business. And Winston was very, very informing his customers about, floor covering and how the best things go with the different tiles and different carpeting and all that. And so our father had taught him all that. And so by the time he was a teenager, he was managing 2 tile stores. And he also was going to the local pool hall, which was totally fascinating to him, even though our father would drag him out of the pool halls every evening. But on his way to school, he would always stop off in the pool hall. And that's where he learned to shoot pool, which came in very fortuitously for him many, many years later. So on one of his jobs, this happened in the early 50s, on one of his jobs as the manager of a carpeting store, he received a call one day from a customer in Grosse Pointe, a rich area outside of Detroit, with a complaint about a carpeting job. So Winston said, well, let me come out and see what the problem is, and we'll fix it. So Winston drove out to this mansion, and the man that opened the door, the customer, turned out to be Miles Davis, the jazz trumpeter. So Winston and Miles Davis sort of started a friendship. And Winston shared with Miles Davis that one of his dreams was to open a jazz club someday. And Miles Davis said, "You're just a kid. What do you know about running a jazz club?" And so Winston said, "You watch, I'm going to do that someday." And after a while, Miles Davis believed him. And he said, "Well, you make it happen and I'll come." And as it turned out, many, many years later, well, several years later, not that many, but in 1961, Winston opened the Jazz Temple in University Circle. He moved to Cleveland in 1959. And right away, that very first night that he went there, he was visiting some relatives on Quincy Avenue. And in the next block, there was a pool hall. And so Winston and his friend Joe visited the pool hall, and Winston played a game that was called One Pocket. And in one evening, after playing One Pocket for several hours, he won $35,000. And with that, he opened up his first business in Cleveland, and that was in 1959. And one of the people that he played pool against that evening on his first night in Cleveland was a man named Carl Stokes, who later became the mayor. And he and Winston remained friends for many years. And so after Winston opened the first tile store, he went on, and all of his businesses were in the Glenville area. So he opened business after business after business, and they were very successful. And then the Jazz Temple was a huge success. It was right on the corner. It was located right on the corner of Mayfield and Euclid in what was called the Mayfield Triangle. And but he encountered some problems because the residents of Little Italy and the Mayfield community, they didn't want them there. In fact, there was an Italian restaurant right across the street, and they refused to serve some of the most famous jazz legends that you've ever heard of. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Dizzy Gillespie, and Dizzy Gillespie, some of his bands went over one evening to get dinner, and they were refused service. And the people actually told them, "We don't serve niggers in here." So then the band members went back over to the club, and they told Dizzy Gillespie, "Do you know what they told us? They said that they don't serve us." And Dizzy Gillespie said, "Well, they're going to have to tell me to my face." So Dizzy Gillespie went over to the restaurant, and they told him to his face that they wouldn't serve him. So as a result, Winston and his girlfriend, Charlene, they lived in a large home over on East Boulevard near Wade Park. And they would make elaborate dinners and invite all of these jazz legends to their house for dinner. And I was living there by that time, and I kind of helped out with cooking, and I was basically a sous chef, I guess, doing all the chopping and all that. but that's how they serve the jazz legends. And one bit of my personal history with this is when I first moved to Cleveland, on the first day I was there, and Winston was getting my suitcases out of the back of the car and everything. So we were going inside, and I heard this music coming from upstairs in the loft, and to me it just sounded like noise. And I said, "What is that?" And at the time, of course, I was 19 years old, and at that time I was still swooning over Johnny Mathis and Sam Cooke, so I didn't know anything about jazz. And so Winston said, "Don't you know anything?" And so he was telling me how beautiful the music was. And he said, "By the way, that's a friend of mine, and he's practicing. So, and he's rehearsing for a performance. Don't ever go up there and don't bother him." And I found out a few days later it was John Coltrane. And John Coltrane used to stay at his house whenever he came to Cleveland. So after the Jazz Temple was open for a few years, there had been so many threats. And I mean, I used to answer the phone there, and the language of those threats were really scary. And there were several attempts to eliminate the Jazz Temple from the Mayfield Triangle, but they didn't use enough dynamite. They put dynamite in windows, and there would be several small explosions and all that. But the final one came in 1965, and it really took half the building down. So, but the Jazz Temple had been extremely successful, and it was known all over the country, and all the jazz greats appeared there. So after that, Winston continued to open several other buildings, and then in July of 1968, while the Glenville shootout was going on, Winston had a restaurant at that time called the Hot Potato. And the Hot Potato, again, was another really successful restaurant. And a lot of the local gambling hierarchy used to go there after they were gambling all night. So anyway, Winston was hosting a bunch of the local gamblers in the back of the Hot Potato. He had a private room back there where they would go and gamble in secret. So in July 28th is when it happened. And Winston was gambling with 6 really, really famous gamblers, and he beat all of them. And then it came down to just Winston and this one other gambler who was the top of the local gamblers. His nickname was Git. And Winston beat Git for 3 days. And for 3 whole days, they gambled together. And Winston won $500,000. And with that money, he literally started purchasing property all up and down the 105th and Euclid area. And all those buildings at that time were abandoned because all the white business owners were afraid of the riots, and they had left. And all the buildings were just abandoned, and it was just a crime-ridden area. And Winston literally made something out of nothing because he recognized that there was a potential there. And he did it. He started refurbishing buildings and remodeling. And in no time, it was a refurbished area. And some of the local reporters referred to it as an inner city Disneyland. Or some of the local headlines said, Winston Willis's Miracle on 105th Street. And it was extremely popular. Winston had hundreds of employees, and he opened restaurants, movie theaters. But the first business that he opened in that building right on the corner across from Great Drugstore was the adult bookstore. And that was a bookstore that showed adult movies. And he did not make the movies, but they did show the movies there, and they sold books and that kind of thing. So that started some enmity among the locals, and they didn't like that. But after that, he opened Scrumpy Dump Theater, then he opened Performing Arts Theater, then he opened the New Orleans restaurant. And I mean, just business after business after business. And I actually worked in most of the businesses there. I worked in the office, and Winston had started his corporation, and it was called University Circle Property Development Incorporated. And that was on the second floor. And he also rented office space to local doctors and lawyers and accountants. And one of his longtime tenants was Jim Brown, who had his organization there. And the year prior to Winston purchasing the building was the Ali Summit, when all the athletes, all the Black athletes, some famous Black athletes all over the country had converged in Cleveland to give support to Muhammad Ali after he refused the draft. And but Jim Brown continued to rent space from Winston for many years. So after that, Winston was encountering so many attempts to remove him from that area. And he had a bunch of high-paid, high-profile lawyers that were representing him in court. But the local judiciary was so corrupt that every single case Winston brought before them, they just threw it out of court. And the lawyers weren't able to protect him, so Winston started representing himself. And he literally became a legal scholar by necessity, because naively, he still believes in the law. And he thought that he could make the law work the way it was intended to, but that didn't happen. And over the years, he mounted lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, trying to prevent them from stealing his properties. And so for 15 years, his fight continued. And so he started the 105th Empire in July of 1968. And up until 1982, he held on, and he continued to fight. But in 1982, is when they really trapped him. They actually trapped him and arrested him for a bogus check that they claim that he wrote for $428. Now, at the time, you have to understand, Winston was a millionaire. Now, what millionaire can't cover a $400 and some check? I can tell you from my own knowledge that that amount of money was kept in petty cash in the restaurant, or more than that in petty cash. But it was a trap for them to get him out of the way, and they did. And they drove him around after he was arrested in his office. The police drove him to 7 different penal institutions in the state of Ohio, and every single one refused to accept him as an inmate because there was no crime. They couldn't prove a crime. But the final one in Chillicothe, Ohio, somehow they were about to let Winston go home, and then the warden received a phone call from somewhere at City Hall, and they decided to accept him in as an inmate. Now, this was in 1982, and after he was accepted, a few days later, 2 guards came into his cell and told him, "We have an order to take you to solitary confinement." And when Winston asked them for what, they only could tell him, "We don't know, we just have an order." So for several days, Winston was in solitary confinement without access to an attorney, without being given permission to make a phone call. He was locked away, and while he was in solitary confinement, the entirety of 105th and Euclid, from 107th all the way to 105th, that entire area was seized and destroyed. I mean, to rubble. All the buildings were gone. And that's how they took his property and gave it to Cleveland Clinic. So going after that, Winston was reduced to living in abject poverty. He had nothing else. And so he devoted his life to research. And again, he literally became a legal scholar. And that's when he continued to fight. And in 1999, I went to visit him on Halloween weekend. And he asked me if I could stay for a few days to help him prepare his petition to the United States Supreme Court. And I said, okay, I can stay a few days. I ended up staying 4 years because the few days after I arrived there, this company started stealing his last building, the last building that he owned. And that was at the corner of 59th and Euclid. So we fought to save that building, and they took it anyway. And that was particularly horrendous because Winston came up with a plan to remove that case from the local housing court to the federal district court. And that case had been removed. I personally served the judge the papers notifying him that he no longer had jurisdiction over that case. And the judge in that case went ahead and held the hearing anyway, and he told us to vacate the building by 8 o'clock the next morning. The next morning, the SWAT team showed up and Cleveland police surrounded the building, and they made us leave the building. It was November 8th of 2000. It was snowing like crazy. It was very cold. And they made us leave the building, and they made us wait in a parking lot across the street. I sat in that parking lot with my brother in his truck when the wrecking ball came. And then the locksmith came and changed all the locks on the back door so that nobody could get in. And my brother's 2 sons were there. And at first they refused to leave, but somehow we talked them into leaving because they were also in danger. But the wrecking crew took the building down, and my brother sat there and watched while they took his last building and reduced it to rubble. And I left and went over to another relative's house. I couldn't stand to watch it anymore. So after that, Winston continued to fight. And there was nothing else we could do. So my only contribution to this was to write his story. And I knew I had to do something, and there was nothing else I could do except to tell the story. When I finally went back to my home in California, I submitted the story as a screenplay. I submitted it as a documentary and any other thing you can imagine. And everyone in Hollywood, all the producers that I met with said, this is a powerful story and it should be told. But we just think it's so unbelievable that it's not going to appeal to a mass audience because nobody is going to believe it. And so I've been hearing that for years. And that's what brings me to the decision to write it as a book. So.
Well, let's just say, I have so many thoughts and we want to open it up to questions for sure. Ms. Willis Carrasco, I want to say to you, as a person who has been involved in understanding the ways in which this government works, it's why I direct the Social Justice Law Center and the Social Justice Institute, largely to expose the ways in which the law, although it doesn't work the way that it should, is absolutely working the way that it's designed to. So many times I've heard people who don't look like me say, oh, this just couldn't be true. I'm thinking about the individuals who were tortured in Chicago by a police commissioner there by the last name of Burge. Oh, it just couldn't be true. It just couldn't be true.
Yeah.
And the reality is that community always knows the truth. And finding a way to make sure that that truth is more broadly exposed and accepted can be many of our life's works. When you say you didn't have anything else to do, it sounds like you did a whole lot. You've done a whole lot.
Thank you. Thank you.